My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and I'd definitely like to welcome everybody to our Curator Conversation today. We are going to be talking with our museum director and our curator of history, respectively, Mr. Christopher Kolakowski and Mr. Kevin Hampton. And we're going to be talking about the conflict or the upcoming conflict in the Ukraine. These gentlemen are going to give you some information, some historical information leading up to what possibly might be happening in that region here shortly. Just as a reminder, if everybody could submit their questions via chat, use the chat feature on Zoom to submit your questions to either myself or to Ms. Jennifer Carlson. We will put all those questions into a PowerPoint at the end. We'll bring that up and everybody can see them. And quickly before we get started, I would like to thank Ms. Jennifer Carlson and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support and offering this free programming to you and allowing us to do it as well. And I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Generac Power Systems, for their continued support. Without those two organizations, we would not be able to bring you this free and fantastic programming that we continuously put out every single month. And we are going to continue to do this as 2022 rolls through and into 2023 as well. So look forward to more great programming from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and you can always find our information on our website, wisvetsmuseum.com. On that note, I will stop talking and I will turn the floor over to our museum director, Chris Kolakowski, and our curator of history, Mr. Kevin Hampton. Gentlemen, welcome today.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having us, and thank you to the Veterans Museum Foundation for their support. And thank you all for spending part of your lunch break, your Friday with us on this, what's an important topic, a timely topic, and is something that is in the news even this morning, the conflict over Ukraine. And it's a conflict that has very deep roots. It's a conflict that is rooted in some way, and the perspectives of both sides are rooted in some history, recent and not so recent, and geography as well. And so what we want to do in the time that we have here today is we want to explore some of those roots. We're not here necessarily to advocate for one side or the other, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to probe those roots, and as the title says, dissect the Ukraine conflict. And as you read what's going on, or as you follow what's going on, hopefully give you some things to think about to help you understand and have some additional perspective of what's in the headlines. And so that's what Kevin and I are going to do. We've assembled what hopefully will be a very interesting conversation for you today. We're certainly looking forward to it for sure. I will say this does also, in case you all are wondering, what's Wisconsin have to do with this? It does fit into our interpretive framework. Every veteran is a story. Wisconsin was there. This still matters. This definitely still matters, as we're going to spend most of our time talking about. But Kevin, I'm going to let you kick us off by establishing the Wisconsin connection to this conflict, recent and perhaps not so recent. And then we'll get into the meat of the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You're right. I mean, Wisconsin was there and is still there. Even in this very moment, if you think about it, and especially recent years, but in particular, one great example, I'm sure many of our viewers may see or may know already, that the 107th Maintenance Company of the Wisconsin National Guard is actually deployed currently into Eastern Europe, and they're coming back. I think they're scheduled to come back later this spring. But this is just the most recent in a series of deployments that have happened over the last roughly 10 years, certainly since 2014, which we'll get into in a little bit of why. But so the 107th out of Sparta is there currently now in training our allies in Eastern Europe as part of the NATO forward deployment. And Wisconsin's connection actually to this area and this conflict in this area goes back 80 years. We here at the museum actually have several oral histories from individuals that actually were born or lived in the Ukraine area in Ukraine during World War II. And their oral histories are fascinating to read through from their perspective, of course, because they're engaged, as we'll talk here in a little bit. They see kind of both sides of this conflict, having been children, only about 10 years old. Both of them were only about 10 years old at the time when the German army comes through, and then when the Soviets come back through as well. And so their perspective is great. They're oral histories are always available to listen to and read. And I highly encourage you guys, anyone listening, to do that, because it gives that great historical perspective. So I think it's very safe to say that we can definitely establish Wisconsin was there. Never mind those Wisconsinites that are aboard the carrier Harry S. Truman in the Mediterranean, which recently entered the Mediterranean Sea and was recently ordered not to continue on into the Middle East, into the Persian Gulf with the fleet. They actually are now holding position in the Ionian Sea to help bolster the confidence of the defenses in that area and our allies in that area. So, and we know of several Wisconsinites that are aboard the Truman today.
Well, and also just to put a fine point on it as well, there have been Wisconsin National Guard that helped train and advise the Ukrainian army in the last couple of years.
Right.
So Wisconsin is even though it's halfway around the world in some ways from the Badger State, it most definitely is touching people within our borders for sure. I think Kevin had a phone call.
Just hung up. All right.
So let's get into the conflict itself, Kevin, and let's start with a general orientation about what Ukraine is and where it is. And Kevin, I'll let you. We are known as the Museum Men with Maps. You will see plenty of them today. So Kevin, why don't you kick us off?
So we as Chris said, we can't not have a map or two or 12 in a conversation between Chris and I. But let's start with, where are we talking about? You know, you mentioned that Ukraine is, you know, in many ways seems like it's halfway across the world. And we know that it's in Eastern Europe. So let's look at the map. Hopefully it's the current map that's up, Chris.
Yep, it's Europe.
Perfect. And you can see here, just to orient ourselves of what we're talking about, is Ukraine, obviously there in Eastern Europe. It is one of the, it's actually one of the first countries just west of Russia, which we'll talk about extensively, because you could argue in some perspectives it's part of Russia. But we want to point out here in particular, even from this map, you can see a very key geographical feature. Chris, can you tell us what this is?
That, and I want everybody, when you look at any of the maps that we're going to show you from whatever era, if you're trying to orient yourself and figure out where Ukraine is, look at this river. This is the Dnieper River. It is actually the second longest river in all of Europe. And it's very big, broad. It really, as you can see there, divides the country basically 2/3 to the west, 1/3 to the east. It's a major geographic. You'll see on a later map, we'll show the roads and rails. It can only be crossed in about 5 major places. And it really is historically and currently is something of a dividing line, and certainly is a major defining feature of the Ukraine in and of itself. And you can see, you're getting a preview from Kevin's screen, some of the variety of things we're going to show you. But if you're looking to figure out where Ukraine is, where we are relative to Ukraine, the Dnieper River is what it's known as, is a great landmark. It's a strategic landmark, has been for centuries, and remains so today.
And I also want to bring up a current map, just to orient ourselves here, which is what I was trying to find. But before we do that, so now we've identified where, obviously, we're talking in terms of location. What I do want to show here is what kind of size we're talking about. You know, it's very easy when you're looking at a map to kind of lose that sense of scope of how big is something. So this map, I think in particular, is great because hopefully it gives us that understanding of, we're talking about a country that's about the size of New York to Chicago. So Chris, could you orient us here on this map?
Sure. This is from the CIA World Fact Book, and it's an overlay. One of the things that most people, you're right, don't necessarily have a sense of geography. So it's useful to do this in terms of U.S. geography. Eastern Ukraine, the area that's disputed today between the Russians and the Ukrainians, known as the Donbass, the Donetsk Basin. is New York and northern New Jersey. And then you start working west, you can see the four major cities of the country. There are many others as well, but these are the four largest cities of the country here. Kiev, the capital, Kharkov, Odessa on the Black Sea, and then Lvov in the very west. And then you can see the Crimea to the south there extending down to Raleigh, which is approximately where Yalta is. If you're familiar with World War II history, that's where the final conference of the Big Three before the end of the war against Germany occurred in 1945. But this gives you an idea of the space. And just to give you additional space, if Chicago sits in what on this map would sit in what is now southeastern Poland. If you go from Chicago up, you are approaching Warsaw in Poland. So that gives you, when you go from Chicago to Madison, you're approaching Warsaw in Poland. So most European countries, with this exception, this is the second largest country in Europe, most European countries are roughly the size of American states. This one obviously is a little bit larger.
Can you see this one, Chris?
Yes, this is the road and rail. This was the next one I was hoping we'd discuss. This is the road and rail network of Ukraine. And this is a modern map. You can see Poland up there to the northwest in Warsaw. And then you can see, if you look, you can see several of the cities that we've been discussing already. Of course, right in the center, there's Kiev as he circles, Kharkov there to the east. And if you could run the cursor along the Dnieper River, Kevin, for everybody's edification, there you go. And you'll notice there's only a few major crossings, only 5, 6 major crossings of the river. It is a very broad river. It is, I would think of it as their equivalent in many ways to the Mississippi.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too.
Is what it is. But you'll notice road and rail network concentrated primarily in the southeast for reasons we'll discuss because of the industrial base. And then you'll also notice rivers. Most of the rivers west of the Dnieper run north-south. Most of the rivers to the east, to the southeast of the Dnieper, run north-south, whereas the ones northeast of Kiev, if you could get up there, please, thank you. Northeast of Kiev in this area generally run east and west. So from a defensive standpoint, if you're getting attacked from the east, the vulnerable part is that northeast area of Kiev. The area annexed by Russia is that pink area there to the east, to the southeast around Luhansk and Donetsk, which in World War II was known as Stalino. And then also Crimea, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which Kevin was circling with his cursor also. Those are areas that are, to put it diplomatically, under disputed control.
The most diplomatic way you could say that.
One other thing I want to point out to you is from Kharkov to the Dnieper River through Poltava is just over 100 miles.
Okay.
So that's something that needs to be borne in mind. And the other thing that needs to be borne in mind is east of the Dnieper, with the exception of the area around Donetsk, the area that's under dispute there in the southeast, it's flat. You're talking terrain very much like Northwest Indiana, northern central Illinois. That's what you're talking about. It gets rougher to the west, a little rougher to the southeast in the Donbass, but by and large, this is the eastern extension of what becomes the North European plain, Flanders, that area in Belgium. This is the eastern extension of that plain. Did we miss anything, Kevin?
I don't think so. I think we'll have great examples in our historical conversation, or our conversation about the historical nature of this region, of that geography and that topography. One thing you had mentioned that I do want to make sure that we get included here so that people can understand, if I can figure out a great way to do this. This one, you really hit it on the head, I think, of why we're talking about the certain region that we are. So can you explain to us a little bit about what's going on?
There are two reasons why Ukraine is coveted by Russia. One of them is economic and geostrategic, which I include economic and geography in. The other is historical, and we'll get into that here very shortly.
Yep.
This map, which is a modern map, by the way, illustrates the economy, the economic resources, the natural resources in the Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union for the duration of the Soviet Union's existence. At the time, at one point, 90% of the mines, or 90% of the coal for the Soviet Union came out of Ukraine. 40% of the iron ore came out of the Ukraine. This map here actually illustrates well the southeastern area that we're talking about, Donbass. This is from 1921. And what it translates into is Donbass, the heart of Russia. And that's what the Soviets feel 101 years ago right now. And so southeastern Ukraine for over 100 years has been valued by the leaders in Moscow because of its economic importance to the Soviet Union, the Soviet economy, and now I would argue, obviously, to the Russian economy as well. The raw materials here make this area very, very important.
And again, for reference, here's the Dnieper.
Right, there you go.
So the other thing that I want to point out, actually, no, we'll get to that one later. I don't know later. So we've talked a little bit about why geographically, resource-wise, this is a important spot for the Russian mentality of why this area is important. One thing that I do want to bring up, if I can quick, just to give us context, is this piece. Because it's, as we know, these are people. This isn't just about land. And it actually lends itself to one of the more recent justifications for what's happening. What can you tell us about this, Chris?
You just highlighted the Dnieper River, so thank you for that.
Yep.
This is an ethnolinguistic map of Ukraine. In other words, one of the things that you hear about this conflict is, and you see it in voting patterns, you see it in maps like this, is the eastern part of Ukraine is much more ethnically Russian than the western part, which is much more ethnically Ukrainian. And you'll notice as you look at this map, which demonstrates the blue colors are very overwhelmingly Russian, either Russian speaking or Russian descent. The teal color is kind of a mixed area, and then all the orange is degrees of Ukrainian, and then there's some other minorities in there as well. But you'll notice how much to the east and in the Crimea is very much ethnically Russian. And that's one of the things that you'll notice in the messaging is there were a lot of ethnic Russians that were left outside of the Russian borders with the collapse of the Soviet Union. You see that in the Baltic states, you see that in Belarus, you see that in a lot of places. And one of the arguments is, and some of the troops actually that are fighting in the southeastern corner are Russian separatist troops. They're fighting to create in fact, they've declared an unrecognized republic out there, which is a separatist republic that it wants to join Russia at some point. But this is important to remember. You're right. It's not just land, it's not just resources, but it's people. And as we look at the maps of Ukraine through history very shortly, I want you to keep this map in mind, because you will see again and again, the Dnieper is a border. The Dnieper you'll see a similar divide among the various borders as they move across Ukraine. And the result of all of that, when you look at this map and you look at the historic maps of Ukraine, and I'm talking about the ones from pre-World War I, you'll see how this ethnic division was created in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's something that needs to be borne in mind.
Very much so. And that actually lends us into this great discussion of, let's talk about how long we tend to think of, countries as, oh, they've always been a country. Not necessarily so. We have the luxury of, in our own time, in our own context, of always knowing, that's always been there. Take Poland, for example. That's not always, it's been there off and on and all that. I'm only doing that because certain individual joining me today, may or not be Polish. But let's take a look back at the history of this area and how it's
developed
into these borders that we know of today. So
to that point, yeah, let's pull up the partitions of Poland. Vladimir Putin has said is on the record saying to world leaders, and this is a direct quote, Ukraine is not really a country.
Yep.
The Ukraine that we know today, you're right, existed as part of the Soviet Union, but has really only existed as an independent country since 1991, since the fall of the USSR.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, it was one of the battlegrounds of Europe, and this map illustrates it very well. You'll see this is the Kingdom of Poland in 1772 at the beginning of the partitions. There's a lot of things we're going to do with this map. First of all, Kevin, if you could point out the Dnieper River for everybody.
Let's see if I can find it.
Your cursor's right there. Come on up to the northeast. You'll see the Great Bend, and then come up, and then that's Kiev. You just passed Kiev right there. Notice how the Dnieper River even then is a border.
Mm-hmm.
And notice how the Russians control the eastern part. Also, this was the Cossack bands over here, some of the famous cavalry. But you'll also notice to the south there, Ottoman Empire. This was a battleground of Europe for centuries. In fact, I had ancestors that rode with Jan III Sobieski in campaigns in this region. And it was a battleground of Europe, and the borders moved back and forth. Kiev, by the way, was one of the original spiritual foundings of the Rus Confederation, about 900 AD, which of course becomes Russia.
Yep.
So Kiev, which you'll notice has is a Russian bridgehead on the river, has tremendous spiritual significance to the Russians, even to this day, to Russian culture, to the Russian identity as a people.
That's interesting because for the longest time, in fact, I mean, all the way back through Catherine the Great, this area was known as Little Russia or New Russia.
Yes.
Now
which is a term that is highly offensive to Ukrainians.
Well, that's what I was saying. It's a terribly offensive term today.
Yes.
Because of how it could be, how it is used actually, and how it is perceived. But Catherine the Great writes about the Russification of this region, and makes it very clear that this is Little Russia, and then you have Greater Russia. So it's in there, even in the language that they use, even in the identity of how they talk about the people of this area, they consider it Russian.
Shakespeare asked, "What's in a name?" The
Exactly.
answer is quite a lot.
Yep.
And the other reason we bring up this map is not just to show you what Poland ruled in 1772 when it started to be partitioned, but also look at the colors and look at what Russia takes over. All of the reds and the pinks and the burgundies is what Russia takes over in the partition. You'll notice that it is effectively almost all of what is today modern Ukraine, the Baltics, and Belarusia. That's the first time the Russians control all of what is today modern Ukraine. Some of the area around Lvov there, what is now Western Ukraine, was under the Austrians. Actually, yeah, if you could stay there for just one second.
Yep.
It's at that point, once this is done in 1795, that the Russians really start the Russification process. In fact, Alexander II in the mid-19th century, the Tsar, issued a decree banning the Ukrainian language.
Yeah.
They were trying to do the same thing with the Poles, I might add. There are nationalist movements that are developing in many of these countries that are now the Baltics, Poland, Ukraine, White Russia, Belarusia. And that's where all this gets started. And it really creates an ethnic identity among Ukrainians.
Yeah.
I have met Ukrainian military personnel. They did an exchange when I was working in Norfolk, just to illustrate how they called me their Polish cousin. I spoke to them in Polish. The languages are close enough that I could speak to them in Polish, and they understood completely what I was saying. I couldn't speak much Polish to them. They spoke very good English, but you get the idea. There was definitely cultural ties there.
Yeah.
And a lot of it goes back to the fact that Poland had ruled what is Western Ukraine today for several centuries before partition in 1772.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the roots of all this, when you look at maps like this and you think about this centuries of history where Ukraine didn't really exist as Ukraine.
Right.
When you look at this map, you think about this process, you begin to realize Vladimir Putin, from his total perspective, this really hasn't been a country.
Right.
He's from his perspective, he's got a point.
And so we're talking, you know, what, 250 years ago? Let's look at 100 years ago. And it's still the same situation.
After World War I, the Baltic states to the north there, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, perfect, thank you, get their independence, as does Poland. And the Polish-Soviet War breaks out. Russo-Polish War is also what it's been called. Yep. This is the limit of expansion of the Polish Republic. The border, the black line that you see right there, is the 1939 border. Thank you. That Kevin's tracing is the 1939 border. But the tan area is the limit of their expansion during the war in the early summer of 1920. Notice they're pushing into Ukraine. They're trying to recreate the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
And they've actually captured Kiev. And if you could trace the Dnieper River for everybody, you can see they're pushing back. They're trying to redraw the map to 1772.
Yep.
They end up obviously not fulfilling all of their objectives, but the fact that they push into Ukraine is a big deal.
Yeah.
And it also is the first sovereignty for Ukraine as a country, because one of their the Polish fellow travelers and allies is a guy named Simon Petlura, who is celebrated today in Ukraine because he is the first one to set up a provision. There's Petlura there. He gets assassinated in 1926. But there's Simon Petlura. He's a Ukrainian nationalist and founds a provisional government and creates the Ukrainian People's Republic, which ultimately gets conquered by the Soviets and he dies in exile. But that is the first step towards sovereignty for this country in about 1,000 years, to be completely honest. And Petlura today is, and most people outside of if you don't study Eastern European history of post-World War I, you probably don't know who he is, but let me tell you, they know who he is in Ukraine. There's absolutely no question about that. But again, notice how much Russia controls.
Mm-hmm.
They control the eastern half, they control the southeastern half, and if you think about that map we saw earlier of the ethnic distribution of Ukraine, you see how those divisions are created over time, just by populations being sorted as borders move and as rulers change and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Am I missing anything, Kevin?
No, I think that's good. I was just going to highlight for people, as you're looking here, remember that Kiev is essentially in the center of modern Ukraine, a little bit to the left, and just south of Chernobyl, which is a name that everyone probably recognizes. And I think if I can, this is very rough, so you'll have to bear with me, but essentially the modern border cuts up here and cuts down, just incorporates Sumy, which is probably not how you say this. This is why Chris is doing most of the talking today.
Pronunciation's real good.
Hey, good. Takes, so you have Kharkov here, and then the area in particular interest for us today, or for today's perspective, is just southeast of Kharkov. It's this area down here. So this is all what we're looking at. You know, it's sometimes hard to, again, wrap our minds around it, but this essentially is all of Ukraine today. So just keep that in mind as we keep going here. Now, this isn't the first time that this area, as you'd mentioned, been a battlefield, possibly, or at least impacted by these powers playing against each other across history. One of the most famous, of course, is in our recent memory, is going to be about 80 years ago. As you're looking at this map alone, I'm sure most of you who have perhaps studied World War II history might recognize place names like Minsk, Kiev, Kharkov, Moscow, Kursk. Sorry, Kursk.
Yeah, that's Kharkov there. And if you go straight north,
Right, it's right there.
That's
That of
Kursk,
course,
yep.
and Moscow, and so this whole region plays a very key role in World War II. And as I'm talking, I should have been bringing up my next map.
Actually, hang on a second, Kevin. Before we get to World War II, there is
Of course.
something that happens 10 years before that that profoundly impacts Ukrainian. Yes, thank you.
Yep.
The Ukrainian president has cited this statistic. This statistic is in some, there's some dispute as to exactly how many died, but from 1932 to 1933, through changes in agricultural practices, changes in policy, a famine struck the Ukraine that killed several million people. I've seen numbers anywhere from 1 million up to 20. The most commonly accepted number in the Ukraine, and the one you will hear quoted again and again, is this 7 million one here, including by the Ukrainian president last year.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to know why and this is a poster that was done for one of the anniversaries, but if you want to know one of the reasons why Ukrainians dislike the Russians and distrust the Russians so much, this is part of that Russification too. And this is part of that. In the United States and many other nations, Russia does not, but many nations do recognize this as a genocide. And it also, this population decimation also allowed more Russians to move in, particularly into the industrial areas, before the Second World War and even after the Second World War. Of course, Chernobyl power plant being part of that when it's founded in 1970. This monument is here in the United States. You don't have to go that far for a commemoration. This is in Bloomingdale, Illinois, one of the suburbs of Chicago, just west of O'Hare Airport. But this was put up by the expatriate Ukrainian community to commemorate what they call the Great Famine, or the Holodomor is what they call it. And I think I butchered that pronunciation. But this is their memorial to the Great Famine. You can see 1932 to 1933. Tremendous death, and it is a scar. It is a scar on the Ukrainian people to this day. And that's a piece when you think about mentality. When you think about the mentality of both sides, you need to understand this history, because this helps inform the Ukrainian side and why there's mistrust of Moscow. Mm-hmm. Coincidentally, Nikita Khrushchev is from Kiev. He was Ukrainian ethnic, coincidentally, but that's a whole other talk for a whole other time. On the Russian side, of course, Putin views the world through trying to recreate the Soviet sphere of influence. And to him, Ukraine is a part of the sphere of influence, not to mention the fact, as we get into World War II, the Germans, as they rolled into Russia, the approximate limit of their advance on their southern front was the approximate eastern border of Ukraine. And this is a great schematic map of the campaign here in 1941. And you can see the pink area, there's the Dnieper River, perfect. And the pink area is where the Germans had moved from September 1931 after winning the largest encirclement battle in history outside of Kiev in September 1941. And then marched on Moscow, but also marched east and southeast into Crimea, and then east into the Donbass toward Kharkov, as you can see there. And you'll notice, if you were to transpose a modern map onto this, the eastern border of Ukraine is approximately the German front line, that solid blue line there on their southern front.
So again, just to reorient people, the region that is controversial today is right down here.
In fact, they're using some of the same some of the same pieces of terrain today. Is that same geography. For those of you who have studied the Russian-German War, you should. It's the largest single land war in history. A lot of the industry that they talk about, the Russians moving to the Urals, comes out of Ukraine and comes out of Donbass. They don't get everything. The Germans are able to use some of it, put some of it to their use. But this is an important area for both sides down here. And you can see how the geography, if you look at the fighting here, you see how the Germans first advanced to the Dnieper River, having secured that area. Then they won the Battle of Kiev and then crossed the Dnieper and then pushed east, where basically the winter stopped them. The winter and then Russian counterattack stopped them. But you can see how it flowed across that area. And when you think about, and when you're Vladimir Putin, and this is known as the Great Patriotic War, your parents barely survived the siege of Leningrad. You had grown up with the idea that Russia should never be in this position again. And that's a fundamental part of your world outlook. Imagine now looking at this map and knowing that history and thinking, hearing that Ukraine is talking to NATO about possibly joining at some point,
Yep.
which would put NATO not just in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which the Estonian border to St. Petersburg is only 160 miles. But now look at this. Look at how far NATO would go. They'd go the same distance. They'd go the same distance as in 1941 and
Yep.
in 1918, I might
Yep.
add. The Germans did the same thing with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
Yep.
Again, we talk about mentality. You need to understand this is the mentality. The Second World War and it's the immediate time period has a powerful emotional impact or emotional pull influence on both sides.
Hmm.
And that's something that needs to, this map illustrates quite well.
One thing I wanted to do also while we're in this part, because these are going to be the images that for those World War II buffs out there are probably the most recognizable, which also illustrate the landscape. So we're just going to cycle through a couple of these. But you can see this is from the German advance in 41, the fighting in 42, and then up to essentially the Russian advance in 43, or counter-offensive in 43. And you can see just that wide open area. You can see here, and even in this photo, that long line of tanks, and how this is essentially the steppes, if you will, as we talk about. But that just very flat, very open in this part of the country. Whoops, too far.
Yeah, that's Soviet infantry. The previous one was Soviet tanks in winter.
Yep. But the other part of this, if I can get to the next set of photos. Here we go again, open and open. A little bit of rough terrain, but not much.
That's around that's the west bank of the Dnieper.
Yeah. The other component, though, is of course the seasons. You had mentioned, Chris, that winter stopped their advance. We all, of course, know or have heard of the very famous battles of Stalingrad in the winter of 42 into 43. And what we don't always necessarily know, we know that from our perspective, we hear, the Russians won the Battle of Stalingrad, encircled the German army and pushed back east or pushed back west. When they push back west, it's through Ukraine, it's through that area. And there's a very particular reasoning as to why the timing is important, because there's a very interesting term used. Actually, it's a Russian term as far as I remember. Chris, what is the seasons called? Do you remember?
You're thinking of General Winter, General Mud.
Yes.
Razputitsia is the Russian term, and I probably said that with a Polish accent, but that's the Russian term, mud. And that picture right there. These pictures are great. The winter lasts. The ground is frozen in the southern part. It depends on the variation of the front. It's the same variation of climate. The Russian front in World War II was the same length basically as I-95 along the East Coast. So you get that same temperature variation. In the south, the mud and the rains start about mid-March. It depends on the season. Certainly in that time frame between mid-March and April 1st, sometime in there, the mud's going to start and it's going to stop. It's basically going to stop you. After April 1st until about mid-May, maybe a little bit later, the ground's not going to be dry enough for significant active operations. And so you tend to get, particularly in the 1941, 42, and 43 campaigns, you tend to get an ebb and flow around the mud seasons, because there's a spring mud season, and then there's also a fall mud season. that starts usually runs through October, and then winter sets in sometime in November, depending on your sector of the front.
There's a great, I'm going to interrupt you there quick.
Yeah, go for it.
There's a great quote that I want to share with you from a British journalist who is actually a war correspondent following the Second Ukrainian Front army, the Soviet army. And he describes what he saw in the Ukraine in the spring of '44. Quote, "The Ukrainian mud in spring has to be seen to be believed. The whole country is swamped, and the roads are like rivers of mud, often 2 feet deep, with deep holes to add to the difficulty of driving any kind of vehicle, except a Russian T-34 tank. Most of the German tanks could not cope with it at all."
That's outstanding. That's outstanding. And that proves that in these pictures, and you go back to some of those pictures we saw earlier, the tank column on the dry steppe. Imagine if it's rained and that's all mud.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we bring this up and dwell on this is it affects strategy now. Some of you may, if you've been following the reporting closely, some people are starting to realize that the weather is not, the time is not necessarily on the Russian side if they're going to make a major move. Because of the mud season coming up, let's say March 15th is my personal interpretation of the mark on the wall. That's 61 days from now. So, and realistically, if you're going to invade and try and lop off the eastern half of Ukraine, 60 days, 100 miles to the river, you need that much time.
Yep.
So we're getting close to a decision point. I'm not going to prognosticate. There's too many variables, but the calendar says, and the weather, general mud is coming, and the weather says that either you're going to go before the mud season or you're going to probably have to go after the mud season, if you're going to go at all. And I'm not predicting one way or the other.
Yeah.
On that point. But that's something that needs to be borne in mind.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I do want to bring us up to the maps of today, in particularly the last 20 years, because we have heard recently a lot of what is the situation between those two forces at the moment. And I'm going to start with this one, which I haven't shared with Chris yet, so this will be new. This one shows the essentially that economy that we've talked about dating back 80 years ago, but also through to today. And these are the gas pipelines. There was a big confrontation in the early 2000s. I think it was like 2002 to 2014, between Russia and Ukraine, because as you can see, two of the main pipelines that feed the EU through or for their natural gas come through Ukraine. And at some point, and there are several different, and actually within the borders, 3 of them all converge, if not a 4th there. But there is actually, there was a discrepancy. There was a very well gone over, I guess it was actually covered extensively, this issue that developed between the countries, because at one point the gas was cut off. Russia claimed that Ukraine wasn't paying for what was being transported. Ukraine was claiming that Russia wasn't actually transporting anything, and so on and so forth. So since the early 2000s, there's been a tension building. And we remember, we're now looking at a situation where Russia, the leaders of Russia since 1991, there's an entire generation of young Ukrainians and frankly all the young people across the world who don't remember a Russia that wasn't ruled by Vladimir Putin, whether he was the president or whether he was prime minister. He has always been a figure. So these events since 2000 all stem with one name behind it, if you think about it.
That's true. Yeah.
But you've got 20, 24-year-olds who have no concept, whether they're in Ukraine or in Russia, of what Russia was like before Vladimir Putin. So I want to bring that one up.
Certainly have no memory of the Soviet Union.
Right. So what they're hearing is nothing that they lived through directly themselves. I also want to bring up this map from 2014. So we've talked about 2014 being almost a turning point in this issue, or in this region, because of what happens here in Crimea. And you can see here, this is a track of the movement of Russian armed forces in on the border of Ukraine prior to that occupation and annexing of the Crimea. And I just bring this
Note
up.
the date of the move, Kevin.
Exactly. Yep. I was hoping you'd see that, because if you notice, February to March, they stop in March as they move to the border. Also take note of where they gather and where the concentration of forces are as I bring up this next map, because take in mind, this is what, 8 years ago now that this happens, and regions has been contested since then, and are still obviously being contested today, which is why we're talking about it. But let me bring up this image that was released in a intelligence report.
Yeah, this was last December.
Exactly. Yep. So notice, I don't know, can you see two maps there, Chris? Or am I?
Actually, yeah, I got them side by side.
Perfect. Notice where the troops are gathering. So notice why there's this concern of, well, they've already done this before. They did this 8 years ago. There's legitimate concern that we've seen this happen. We've seen the troop concentrations on the border in the past, and it's happening again.
Well, if you go back to the 1943 map that you showed earlier, these are the axes of attack into Ukraine after the Battle of Kursk in July 1943.
Let me see if I can find that one quick.
So, you know, it's the phrase, what's the phrase? What's old is new again? Yes, this map here.
Yep.
If you look real carefully, you will notice, particularly, I'll let you get situated here first.
Yep, there.
Yeah, but notice the concentration of Soviet fronts, Soviet army groups in the same perimeter, the same basic arc along the, and they're pushing west to the river.
Yep. Here's the Dnieper again, just so everyone remembers. So this is very relevant. Understanding all of this context of why are we talking about, in today's day and age, why are we talking about down here, this group down here? Because it's happened before, whether it was 8 years ago, whether it was 80 years ago, and frankly, as we've seen from these maps, whether it was 250 years ago. This is all part of that mentality of what are we looking at today and why.
This is not ancient history by any means. It still matters. You're absolutely right.
So this is the most recent map. This was actually released on December 3rd, so only a month and a half ago, showing these developments of concentration of troops and of materiel. And you can see it happening between 16th of June and slowly in these areas. But now we're looking at about 100,000 on the border. And here's the area that's being contested at the moment, since 2014, actually. This war has been going on in this region. And if anyone's seen the most recent news today, you know, there's even news coming out as we speak in this moment. Only about an hour and a half ago, the New York Times reported that the White House made a statement that they believe Russian operatives have been deployed inside this contested region to create an event that would justify a Russian offensive in terms of justifying that annexation of this area as well. Chris, is there anything else we should know about or we should talk about before we turn it over to questions? I do want to make sure that we have time because I know we've got a lot of space.
I think
we got a lot of opinions.
I think we've covered it. I think the big thing one of the big things I want people to take away from this is, yes, this still matters, but also to get people to understand the mentality and the roots of these conflicts. That the conflict over this area goes back a long way. It has its roots a long time ago. And you need to understand this history to truly get a sense of the mentality, particularly in Moscow, but also I would argue the mentality in Kiev as well.
Yep.
And that's something that as we think about, as we watch this hopefully unfold in a peaceful direction, this conflict's not going away, though.
No,
Even if nothing happens, this conflict is not going away because of the historical forces that we're talking about here and what we've been talking about here today. And so in the time we've had, I hope people have gotten kind of a sense of that.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I just want to bring up this map, this one last map. We brought it up briefly earlier, but we've heard recently this week amongst the negotiations that have been happening in Geneva, I believe it is, right, Chris?
Correct.
That one of the, Russia has has a list of demands, a published list of demands, that actually is one of the big things is that NATO will prohibit Ukraine from ever joining, which of course, one of the stipulations that was released on Wednesday by our Secretary of State, I believe it was, who said, of course, we support the free choice of any country to join the alliance, kind of thing. But you can see here why this idea that it's no longer, the Iron Curtain is no longer here with that buffer between Russia and the West. In their mentality, I believe, you're seeing that Iron Curtain, if you will, move further and further east.
And with that, I think we'll throw it to Eric for questions.
Excellent, Chris. That was a lot to wrap everybody's heads around, and that was a lot of information. I think that kind of supports the reason why we don't have very many questions. We only have two, actually. So I'll just go ahead and read them out. And the first question says, can you please compare and contrast the Russian actions with the U.S.'s implementation of the Monroe Doctrine?
Ooh, can I actually jump in? Because that leads me into the next thing that I didn't get to talk about, which is I'm going to say it wrong. You're going to have to correct me, Chris. The Medvedev Doctrine?
Medvedev.
Sure, yeah, what he said. This is a doctrine, actually, while the very brief period of time that Putin wasn't president of modern-day Russia is actually just after the annexation, or it's actually just after the aftermath of the Russo-Georgian War, and President Medvedev.
Yep.
Hey, there we go. President Medvedev goes on an interview with Channel 1 Russia, and it's August 31st, 2008. He lists out 5 parts of a doctrine. First, that Russia recognizes the primacy of the fundamental principles of international law. The world should be multipolar. Russia does not want confrontation with any other country. This is the important one. Protecting the lives and dignity of our citizens, wherever they may be, is an unquestionable priority of our country. And the final one, as is the case of other countries, there are regions in which Russia has privileged interests. Now I'll let you answer your question.
I know exactly where this question is coming from because Peter Beinart wrote a column making this exact argument in yesterday's or today's New York Times. And Peter Beinart always makes me think. And the Monroe Doctrine, those of you who may not be familiar, it's the United States basically has a primary role in the security of the Western Hemisphere and has been so. That's been promulgated by President Monroe back in 1819 or 1820. So it's been around for a long time. To be honest with you, countries should act in their self-interest. They should have It's just like the NATO position of countries should be able to determine their fate and determine, and some of that is working with what's in their immediate area. You can argue method, you can argue degree. I understand why the Russians want to be in some of the areas that they are. I get that perspective. And I'll leave it there. You can argue the relativism all you want, but I would, I get that perspective, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, Chris, since I said we only have one question, I now have got many questions. So I am going to go ahead and screen share here real quick and bring up the PowerPoint. And the next question says, why is this happening now? Is the theory that Russia wants access to minerals such as titanium in Ukraine, or is it to have a bigger buffer with NATO?
I know my thought.
What's that, Kevin?
I know my thought.
Go for it.
My thought is NATO. It's a concern with the expansion, and it will always be that. But if you've noticed, when did Russia move on Georgia?
2008.
In what time of the year?
It was a summer campaign, wasn't it?
I think it was this time of year.
Okay.
Because remember, it was the Olympics at the time. Oh no, it was August. You're right. There's always been those two parallel times, whether it's January, February, or July and August, that essentially are the campaign seasons, if you will, in this area of the world. I genuinely believe that it's a NATO concern more than anything else.
I think it's NATO, but I would also argue it's Russian demographics, and because if you look at the Russian demographics, the population is shrinking. The country is growing. Russia's never as strong as you think they are. They're never as weak as you think they are. And this is one of those where Russia appears to be weak. The economy could be doing a lot better. And there's that all creates a little bit of insecurity, I think, in the rulers in Moscow. And I think that's why they've been so sensitive to some of the political protests over the last 10 years. I mean, you can see that in a lot of their actions. And so I think you put those two things together, I think there's your answer.
Well, and I think that's an offshoot of what's been happening the last couple of years. Remember the big push, what was it, last year? No, 2 years ago in 2020 for in Russia, right when the outbreak of coronavirus was happening, that there was this, are they going to have this big military parade in Moscow to commemorate the Great War and those veterans? I think this is all part of a long-term plan. Because if you've noticed what's happened in the last 5 years, what was it, even within the last few months, there's a group that was formed back in the 90s, I think. It's called Memorial in Russia, that is meant to commemorate the atrocities, if you will, of the Soviet regime, especially under Stalin. In fact, Putin himself, I think, was in the KGB offices when they were picketed and protested, when they were surrounded back in, what was it, the 80s or something?
East Germany. When the wall fell, he was the deputy chief of station for the KGB in Leipzig.
Right.
And he was on the phone to Moscow, and they were not picking up the phone. He was requesting orders while the East Germans were outside the embassy or the consulate.
And so if you're looking at changing, and so this group, this memorial group, they set up this monument right outside KGB headquarters, dedicated to those political prisoners and the suffering that they went through. You imagine an ex-KGB officer who sees this, who this is his identity, this is who he is. And you see how now, and the whole part of this is that they essentially disbanded the group. Russian government, the courts said this and disbanded the entire memorial group. So in order to change that narrative, in order to change how they talk about their own history. So you go from this, celebration that Putin was looking for with the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, the Great War, the Great Patriotic War, to this, okay, now we're not going to talk about the bad things in the Soviet Union, which was last year. And now we're looking at this idea that these are Russian people. This is our area. Right? Ukraine is not a country.
Yep.
Next question, gentlemen. I'm going to bring it up here. Just a second. Please explain why joining NATO is far more difficult than initially appears, and the implications not just for Ukraine, but NATO and Russia as well.
That's a great question. And the answer is you can't just join NATO. There are certain benchmarks that you have to meet in terms of society, in terms of like government and governmental standards, economic activity. And then there's the 2% of your 2% of your GDP has to be defense. And there are certain other thresholds that you have to meet as well. I haven't looked deeply into the matter, but Ukraine meets some of them. They don't meet all of them. Same with the Swedes and the Finns. Although the Swedes and the Finns, I think, could probably have it tomorrow for the asking. But Ukraine hasn't met all the benchmarks, and that's where we're at. If they do, NATO is on the record saying that they will entertain an application to join.
Yeah. Also remember, within the last 10 years, there was a lot of protests that were happening. What was it? The Orange
Revolution.
Orange Revolution 15 years ago, or more at this point. I can't remember.
Actually, in 2014, they overthrew the pro-Russian president.
Oh, there we go.
And that's really what precipitated the early moves.
Right. So there's been a lot of upheaval.
Gentlemen, the next question. How does this relate to post-World War I cordon sanitaire?
Kevin, you're a World War I expert.
I have to think about that. It's essentially if I remember correctly, it's essentially the series of alliances in post-World War I Europe that essentially isolated Germany and cut off Russia. If I recall correctly, am I right in that memory?
You are, and
Okay.
and I would argue that this is all of a piece. When
Right.
you think about everything that we've talked about so far, Russia throughout, let's just take the last 250 years. From 1772 forward, Russia has had the West coming in. Even before that, for centuries, people had marched on Moscow, coming in from the West. They had been ostracized. There had been a lot of conflict between Europe. Then the Russian founding of the Soviet Union, the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union becomes basically ostracized. And the cordon sanitaire, it's just one of many notches in the belt of feeling ostracized and threatened from the West.
Right.
So when you think about that buildup of that creates that mentality from the Russians, and then you add NATO expansion to the east into both the former Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Romania, Hungary, the others in what's now Eastern and Central Europe, and then into parts of what was at one time the part of the Soviet Union proper, the Baltics, possibly Ukraine. It really cuts deep. And so cordon sanitaire, I would argue, is part of this historical, if you understand the mindset of both sides, cordon sanitaire is part of that.
Yeah.
Particularly on the Russian side.
Yeah.
Militarily, gentlemen, how do you see this whole thing playing out?
I said we weren't going to get into prognostications.
Mm-hmm.
I have thought about this question a lot, and Kevin, if you jump in, I would be very curious to look at it, and I would be curious to see how much the Azerbaijan, the Nagorno-Karabakh War of 2020 between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which was the heavy use of drones, heavy use of cyber. I would be very curious to see. A lot of militaries have sat up and taken notice of what happened there. And I would wonder how much that would influence. You're not going to see the mass armies like you did in World War II moving across the countryside. Neither side has that. But from a technology perspective, the battle space is actually much bigger, and you don't need those mass armies anymore to necessarily break the enemy line and get where you need to go. And so when I think about where this is going, I would say look at that as a possible guide, but I could be completely wrong.
I would also recommend that we think of it not necessarily as always the traditional sense. I mean, this morning alone, what was the other headline other than, you know, the accusation that there are operatives in this region fomenting a possible or inciting a possible event that would spark an invasion? The other one this morning earlier was the cyber attack that took down the Ukrainian government websites. There are other ways to fight wars now that we are starting to see emerge more.
Let me switch screens here, gentlemen. I'm just bouncing back and forth. We're getting all kinds of great questions now.
These are good questions.
Mm-hmm.
Given our implementation of the Monroe Doctrine, how can the U.S. criticize Russia's actions?
I think we addressed this one sort of before. I would add only this to the discussion that we had before, is that the United States is a treaty alliance partner with NATO nations. And that when you are involving potential threats to NATO allies and associates, the United States has a treaty obligation there that is not reciprocated. And so that would be the only other, in addition to what we've talked about before, that would be what I'd add to the discussion here.
I'm not touching that one.
What is the relative military strength outside of nuclear options between NATO and U.S. versus Russia?
So the frequently cited statistic is the assumption that Russia has about 100,000 to 150,000 troops massing in that area. In particular, what's interesting to note, and I'm going to look more at the last 5 years, well, last 8 years, really, I guess, is the location of some of those troops. But really, what I want to talk about is is NATO's response since the Russian invasion of Crimea. In a couple of years afterwards, I think it was 2016, NATO implemented a policy, or they all agreed on a policy of forward deployment. I think it was, what was it, enhanced forward presence was the official title.
Yep.
To which point there are now 4 what you would call, I guess, battle groups that are actually in locations on that border. The numbers that are actually supporting those, it's a multinational operation. It's not just the United States, but there's troops in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. So it's mostly north of Ukraine, but it's those NATO countries that are the most recent additions to the alliance. And I think the United States, which is why the 107th is in Poland, the United States is the one that's participating in the Polish battle group. And that's why I think I would assume maybe that's why you had that exchange, Chris, with the Polish armed forces, is because that's where our sphere, if you will, for our deployments is. I know Lithuania, the lead nation, is Germany, Latvia is Canada, and Estonia is the United Kingdom. There are other supporting participants in those different battle groups, those 4 battle groups, Denmark, Iceland, Belgium, Czech Republic, Italy, Montenegro even. But most of those battle groups are fairly small in comparison. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but for example, I know as of October of 2020, the Lithuanian battle group was only, I think, 1,233 units, I think, or in 1,233 personnel. So they're smaller groups, but it is obviously the positioning is important, I think, to keep in mind, and that's the best I can answer for that question at the moment.
That's a fairly comprehensive answer there, Kevin.
I don't think it totally answered the question, but it is something that the other thing to keep in mind too is I think the significance, and I can't understate this enough, and Chris and I have talked about this, the significance of the Secretary of Defense ordering the carrier Harry S. Truman to not continue on into the Persian Gulf, but to remain in the Mediterranean and now currently in the Ionian Sea, to be there as support. Which is actually fairly significant, because that whole carrier group is now just off, still within distance of support as well.
The next question, gentlemen, do you have a sense of what the people in the contested area, how they feel about this situation?
The Ukrainians I've talked to, in the most what's the word I'm looking for? The most vivid terms described one of them described his desire seeing the Kremlin in flames in Moscow. There on the Ukrainian side, both from personal experience and from what I've read, there is considerable dislike of the Russians. And that actually seems to be true. A lot of people in the eastern part as well. In fact, they had a plebiscite. I was preparing for this talk. They had a plebiscite in eastern Ukraine in 1992, whether some of those regions that are now contested, and most of them voted to go Ukrainian by like 80%. So there's a lot of, and of course the Russian, we've already talked about the Russian, the perspective of the Russian, excuse me, the Russian government and the Russian leadership. That's what I've gotten. Kevin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I don't have much to add to that. It's been very interesting actually recently. The BBC and ABC have done a lot of interviews in this region in particular, or in the contested area, and I've found it extremely interesting not only to listen to their personal stories and what they've gone through these last 8 years, but also there was a great segment I think ABC did. I think it was ABC, where they talked to people in Moscow about how they feel about what's happening. So I highly encourage people to look that one up, or maybe it was New York Times. I can't remember which, but it was within the last week or two. So I highly encourage that one.
Well, gentlemen, that is all the questions that have come across the board. And we are not too much over time, but we still are over time. That was a fantastic discussion though. And we got a lot of compliments from our guests about how informative it was and how engaging, and just through the regular presentation, a lot of questions were answered for a lot of people out there. So thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate once again you bringing your knowledge and expertise to the table.
More than happy to. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and definitely thank everybody who showed up today to spend their lunch hour with us talking about this very timely and important topic. We hope to see everybody for more of our programming here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, to include Trivia Night coming up next week, virtual movie night discussion coming up at the end of the month, and our in-person mess nights, although I think the one for next week is full and unavailable for more spaces. But we do have another one coming up in April, so please look forward to those in-person events as well as all of our virtual events as well. Yes, Lisa, thank you for bringing that up. This discussion, as well as all of our book talks and curator conversations, can be found on our YouTube channel. Usually takes us a day or two to get them posted, so please look for this one to show up maybe beginning of next week. And we had a fantastic book talk on Monday, which is already up on our YouTube channel right now. So please go to our YouTube channel and look for all of those events that we do have listed there. Thank you again, everybody. Chris, Kevin, thank you, gentlemen, for your time and for your knowledge today. I hope everybody has a safe and pleasant weekend, and we'll see you next time.